hopefully get somebody, one of you, to help in the battle I've been waging for ever since '06, but lately with the Monmouth County people. Hopefully we can get something going on this because it's really crazy. It makes no sense whatsoever. Now, one last comment on your cluster zoning. Back when it was first invented, I was on the planning board in Homedale, and I thought this is the greatest thing since sliced bread. So one of my friends said, well, look at it, see what happens. There might be people like your neighbor, and I had a neighbor who dumped all kinds of trash in the open space behind me. And I went around in New Jersey, went over to the west of here and up in Mendham, and well, he was right. About half of those places ended up as messes. There are ways of doing things, and in Homedale, I think we've had some pretty good luck. But it's not all wonderful. There's a downside, real downside to it. Excuse me. Thank you.
Okay. Right? No, right here.
Yep, sorry, thanks. I just wanted Dan and then I guess Brad Carleton's impression on, or thoughts on privatizing water supply as opposed to municipal systems. Now towns are able to sell their, and it's,
With the,
pardon me?
the with the law, yeah.
So I'd just like to know, hear what your thoughts are on that whole issue. Since we have such a huge bill ahead of us.
Yeah, so let me start out. I actually have an article in last month's New Jersey Municipal, no, I guess it was February, New Jersey Municipalities Magazine. So I wrote about this. And part of the problem is, the real issue is, what are we trying to solve here? And I've posed this issue, in fact I did on April 1st, because I was in a New Jersey Spotlight program, and I posed this question. I've talked with executives in investor-owned utilities. I've talked with executives in publicly owned utilities. And basically what it comes down to is that any decent-sized publicly owned utility should be able to manage themselves just as well as any well-managed investor-owned utility. Should be. Question is, are they allowed to? And that's where the decision-making process comes in, because there are two price signals. Investor-owns make their money, they make their profit from investment, not from supplying water, but from investment. And so their price signal is to invest more, and the Board of Public Utilities is basically there to keep them from investing too much, right? Think about the publicly owned systems. Their price signal is to keep rates as low as possible forever. And the result is they underinvest. And so the system tends to fall apart. And then what happens? Well, somebody has this great idea that we should just sell the system. And so they sell the system, and where does the money go? Does it go back to the people who are paying for the system? No. It goes to the taxpayers, which are not necessarily the same people. And because that money goes into the municipal budget. And so this whole privatization issue is it's a game that is not being played well. And it's a shell game with regard to the money aspect of it. And I've had private sector executives tell me that there are absolutely many situations where privatization makes no sense whatsoever, but if somebody offers them the opportunity to buy it, they will. All right? So they don't tell you this in public, but they've told me this. And so the whole issue with privatization is you have to compare apples to apples, and there's absolutely no reason that a well-run public system should operate any worse, any more expensively, anything than an investor-owned utility.
My experience has been, though, is that I was asked that point blank one time. I said, "Oh, you're just pushing for privatization." I said, "I'm pushing for the water quality. I don't care who does it as long as it meets standard." But there's some realities that you know, the standards are getting tougher and tougher every year. You're going to be treated for more things. Because we get the tech lower, you're going to be treating more and more to lower levels. The sophistication of the treatment systems isn't getting any less sophisticated. That's where I think in some cases, and not all municipalities, but in some cases, the economy of scale you get with a really big international private company. And I'll give you an example. They don't need me blowing their horns. I think they did a great job. What happened down the Swimming River when those lines broke? When I went down and my guys went down and we sat there, they had already had all their engineers around the table, but they already had people in other parts of the country. They already had lines coming from Alabama because they had relationships with people. The lines were coming. When you talk about what happened in New Jersey or at American down at that plant, and I think a few people in Monmouth County, after all the coordination, had low pressure for a while when you saw the gravity of this and how fast they came back up. I know municipal systems, they'd still be looking for pipe after all those years. So I think Dan's right, you have to look at it. It's not right for everybody. My experience with some of the privates, the reason they won't buy a municipal because they're leveraged up to their eyeballs and they want too much money for a system. They owe $20 million and the system's only worth $8. It puts them in a tough spot. But I just think you have to look at it. It is a case-by-case basis. I do personally, I'm not going to say, I think there's a few large municipal systems that should not be in the business. That's just my opinion.
So my counterpoint on that is, when have you ever seen a public utility being handed off to another public utility?
Well, that's probably,
Right? A merger of publicly owned utilities. When have you ever seen that? It makes all sorts of sense. Why doesn't it happen? Because the municipality wants the cash from the investor-owned facility, and a publicly owned utility would never get permission to do that. Never. So it doesn't happen. And the publicly owned utilities don't think in terms of merger and acquisition. It's not how they were invented. So the regulatory system works against you. So something that would make a lot of sense, for instance, my favorite example, and I'll use it because we're in Monmouth County and it's not, Hunterdon County has 5 little wastewater treatment systems. It would make so much sense to have all 5 of them under a county utility authority, managing them as a single entity, not connecting them, because there's no sense in doing that, but managing them all together so that they have economies of scale on engineering and management and billing and all that sort of stuff. Will that ever happen? Not in my lifetime, right? But it should.
Okay, yes, the gentleman in the back.
Earl recently announced a plan on energy to be net positive, installing 32 gigawatts of solar arrays. For them to do that, they're planning to remove, I think, 150 to 200,000 acres of forest.
Earl?
Is there a question in there?
I knew about Great Adventure, but I didn't know about Earl.
Yeah, I just wanted to bring the attention to the panel here and see if you have any comments about that. You made an earlier comment about deforestation.
I mean, I think it's a stupid thing to do. It's stupid. There's plenty of places to put all the solar arrays we could ever want, over parking lots, over buildings, and you see more and more parking lots having solar arrays. They appear to work fine, and people still park there. It's a mystery to me why Great Adventure, for example, the one I'm most familiar with, the management is absolutely adamant that they will cut down trees for their solar arrays. It makes no sense. There's no valid reason to do that.
I'm from Exit 8A. We have, right, that's a New Jersey thing to say, right? I'm from Exit 8A. We have 30 million square feet of warehouse roofs at Exit 8A. Wouldn't that be a wonderful place for a really big solar farm?
I have a lot of farmer friends, and I know they're making money putting it on part of their farms, and I don't want to begrudge them. Nobody works harder than some of the folks I know. But I think it's actually working against the solar industry, cutting down acres and acres of trees, putting them on fertile farmlands when there are so many other places. I think it's actually working against that industry. If I was in their shoes, I would be looking to find some of those warehouses and other places because it works much better.
And they're doing that in Woodbridge, by the way.
Okay, all right, this gentleman and then over here.
A two-part question. What percentage of the water in New Jersey is used by lawn sprinkling, or for lawn sprinkling? And what about, the second part is, what about the idea of charging more per gallon beyond average household use to rein in some of this water sprinkling?
Well, yeah, you know, the figure we had was about 50%, 56%, I think it was, of domestic water use, so that's not counting agricultural and industrial. I don't know what the net total, you know, percentage would be, but it's obviously very significant. And we see that in the fact that wherever progressive rate structures are introduced, you have a big change in the amount of water used. The idea of doing progressive rates is, I think, a really good one, and it's got, you know, it can have thresholds so that you don't have an increase in your rates within whatever we deem to be a reasonable home use, but beyond that you do, and it does seem to influence things. There is sometimes a downside, not a downside to it, but it can be defeated in New Jersey because of the regulations that allow people to build their own wells essentially without regulation. In my town of Medford, years ago when we had the big drought in 1999 or so, whenever it was, and Governor Whitman introduced that summer a moratorium on a lot of water use, a lot of you know, use of sprinklers and so on. The water use from the day before to the day after in my town dropped by half. So it was an indication of how much was used. The town, trying to be proactive, introduced a progressive water rate structure. What they found was that a handful of very, very large home users just dug their own wells. And it had an enormous effect because there was a small number of people with very large properties. And these were not commercial, these were homes, but very large properties where they had put in turf over large areas. So, you know, the fact that we allow people to do their own wells, essentially without regulation. The only regulation is that water that comes out is supposed to be tested to see if it's safe. Can be a way in many places, doesn't work everywhere obviously, but in suburban areas people can get around those rules if they're made too progressive, too aggressive.
Well, and after one of the droughts, I remember the figures on well permits in Monmouth County, and the number of irrigation-only wells on private properties was like 10,000 new irrigation-only wells.
So people will spend a couple thousand, I guess it is, to dig their own well if they care enough about their lawn.
Okay, yes. This lady over here has a hand up.
Well, she has the
She has the
microphone.
microphone. Just let her go.
Is there some threshold that governs governors de jure, whereby you get the 300-foot buffers on these category 1 streams and so forth, and you win these advances for survival, really? You need water to survive. And then you have a governor come in with obvious affiliations for these political aspirations, with people like the Koch brothers, the energy people, and so forth. And all of a sudden, the rug is pulled out from under the entire people of New Jersey. The hard-won victories that you've won, the hard-won victories that the League of Women's Voters have won, the private citizen, is just overridden by a pay-and-play concept. Is there any threshold to stop this type of thing? Because it is terribly, terribly destructive. And people are losing hope in guarding our water supplies and what we need to survive effectively in a highly congested state. What I'm basically saying is, how do you stop these political de jures coming in and doing this?
So
and having some maintenance of standard and threshold that we can stand firm on.
So this is my life, right? This is what we do all the time. In the Pinelands, we have these incredibly strong environmental rules. They have some problems, but they're incredibly strong. It doesn't matter how strong your rule is if the people implementing it are not permitted to do their job and implement it because of the political winds in the state. And on environmental issues, the political winds have not been good for some time. So the message here is, you know, we gotta elect people who care about the environment and who are going to give the blind officials of state agencies the power to do their job. So my only suggestion is, there's another election coming up. you know, and it's going to be decided in the Democratic primary almost certainly. So, you know, hold people's feet to the fire on these issues and hope that they are responsive and there is a culture, a new culture on these issues, and we can get some really good rules we have implemented consistently and fairly day after day, and then improved where we've discovered through experience that they're not adequate yet.
And, you know, I'm a little more cynical. I was on the middle. I was the referee.
More cynical?
Yeah, I'm always cynical.
Oh, I was really cynical.
But I was the one to referee because a lot of different perspectives come to the table when you're trying to iron these things out. And I would just say that, and I've had, no matter what kind of, what party the administration was from, I had meetings with people, oh, I didn't need my law to do that because his buddy or her buddy needed something to get done, and they're telling me that that's not what he meant with the law. So I would forget what you see in the brochures and actually watch what people do once they're in there. I've been with people, meetings with folks that you thought they were like sterling, you know, silver environmentalists and argue with me over an interpretation because they brought somebody in. So I think you have to be careful that if there's good guys and bad guys. I just think that you have to hold people's feet to the fire and make sure they're actually doing what they said to walk the walk. Because I think what they say publicly has very little to do with what's going on behind the scenes. That's just my experience over 35 years. And there were times like you come out of a meeting almost, you want to take a shower. That's the way it is. That's life.
Okay, now the lady back there, and then we'll get to you.
I'm from the Whale Pond Watershed Association, and we're a group of volunteers that are trying to take care of our local watershed. And if you would raise your hand if you're in the Watershed Association, we have about 5 or 6 people here. So there are 5 towns on our watershed, and one of the towns has just approved a development where they're going to tear down 2,100 trees. And I'm sort of flabbergasted about it, and I'm wondering what can we do to make them reduce the amount of trees that they're going to tear down.
See, without knowing all the details, right, because it all depends on where you are, what the municipal rules are, and what applicable state regime there is, can't answer that question except to say, the one thing you got to do is see if there's somebody who's a lawyer, and you get a very good handle on how the regulations apply. Because you cannot take for granted that and I don't know the municipal attorneys and engineers in question in this case, but in general, you know, most of them are there because of the role they play in one or the other political party. It doesn't mean they don't do a good job, but sometimes they don't do a good job. And you just need to be sure that you have a really rigorous, independent evaluation of the development application in terms of the municipal rules and the state regulations to be sure that the professionals who are advising your planning board or zoning board get it right. And if they're not getting it right, that you harass them in getting it right. It is, I mean, one of the good things is that at the municipal level, you know, often the great power we give to municipal boards can be a real detriment to environmental values because most of the people on the boards are not always big environmentalists. But on the other hand, they tend to be more responsive to their community. So if you have good reasons and you show a lot of persistence and a lot of strength and a lot of really good factual arguments, you have a very good chance of having good decisions made at the local level. So it isn't in the hands of, you know, of some of the, you know, other politicians who may not be as responsive to the issue. You know, that's my only advice. Every time we see these things, we just try to really dig into the facts and see what levers there are. Like you may be in the coastal zone there. I don't know if you are, but if you're in the coastal zone, there's some really strong regulatory protections that you can bring to bear. No?
And to quote Yogi Berra, it ain't over till it's over. Right? So one of the things that you see sometimes around the state is that a development gets approved, and yet somewhere along the line, because of the work of a lot of people pushing very, very hard, the land actually gets purchased for open space, and so it never goes to development. But I will tell you that the longer the process has, the further the process has gone through more and more approvals, the harder it is to get the developer to say, okay, look, I'm just tired of fighting, I'll sell it. So if it's already through the approval process, then as Carleton said, you have to look for the leverage through other regulatory processes and see what you can do.
Okay, now this gentleman.
Thank you. A decade or two ago, a lot of the cities in their financial crises sold off their water utilities, privatized. And now some of the cities are considering, I understand, taking back their private, or reintroducing a municipal utility. Do you know of any municipalities that have reestablished a municipal water utility, taken back from the privatization?
The only time I could see that happening, frankly, is in a situation where they had a public-private contract, where they were contracting out the operation of their utility to an investor-owned system. And so eventually they hit the end of the contract and they have to make a decision as to whether they're going to contract out again or not, because they still retain ownership of the system. It's still theirs, all right? And so they have that option. In general, they don't. Camden had a contract with United Water, which is now Suez. They decided to contract out again. New Jersey American got the contract. But they have the option, if they haven't sold it, they have the option to hit the end of the contract and say, okay, we're now going to operate it ourselves. I haven't seen it, but it is at least feasible. If they've actually sold the utility, the notion that any government, especially a city government, is going to be able to afford to actually buy the utility back from the private sector is very, very minimal, if the utility, in fact, ever wanted to sell it. Because there's no way they could force them to sell it.
What do you think is a possibility of regionalization of municipal utilities?
The problem that I have seen is that, strangely enough, the political decision makers are very unwilling to allow control of their local utility go to a regional public entity, and yet seem perfectly willing to let control of their public utility go to, go to an investor-owned utility. All right? So it's a contradictory situation, but it's very tough politically to regionalize existing public utilities. It shouldn't be, but it is. And yet people are perfectly willing to sell it, and it's usually because they're hoping to get a big cash payout.
A lot of these authorities were being stripped, they had pots of money that was supposedly put aside to operate whatever utility it was, and they were being broken apart, and then the government was taking that money. I mean, I saw law firms come through my desk saying, hey, guess what, there's all this money sitting in these authorities that you can get out. And I was like, flipped out, so that's not what we wanted. So, I mean, these regional things, one, everybody's home rule. Secondly, they haven't been that effective in the sense that once they get money to do the things we want them to do, so we can come and dissolve them and take it.
Yeah.
It's like a corporation that saves too much of its money, becomes a target for takeover. That seems to be happening with some of the local utilities around us.
Yeah, the Association
They've accumulated too much cash.
The Association of Environmental Authorities has counted up about $80 million worth of money from municipal utilities authorities that was taken by municipalities because they dissolved the utility authority.
Okay, we're running out of time at this point. All right, one last question, that's it.
We've got a microphone back there.
Well, there was someone who wanted to ask.
The safety of the chemicals that are added to make our water safe, specifically the chlorine that I smell when I'm taking a shower. And recently with New Jersey American Water, we were informed that some other additive was going in. I think it was some kind of ammonium-based thing. And then also the addition of fluorides in our water. And I wanted you to address maybe Fred Sickles, because you're more familiar with New Jersey American Water in my neighborhood.
Okay, you're talking about There's a disinfection byproduct rule. When you add chlorine to something, if there's organic, it turns into trihalomethanes or whatever, which aren't good things. So they have to, if you have to go at all these different points of sampling and monitor for trihalomethanes or haloacetic acids, which is another one that forms from the chlorine wants to react with everything. So if you have, they've really tightened that up from the turbidity of the water to going out and testing for these compounds to make sure that they're below. It's 60 parts per trillion. I think for haloacetic acid, it's 80 parts per trillion for a combination with about 5 trihalomethanes, chloroform, things like that. So they monitor that chlorine because, to be honest with you, chlorination of water has probably been one of the greatest health things ever to this prize. I think it was up in North Jersey. Was it Hoboken or someplace? It was the first place in the world.
Jersey City.
Is that
Jersey City?
Jersey City. And
1908.
things like cholera and everything, they just went right down. So, but you have to balance it. I think you have a great point. Sometimes when you put something in, there's always this unanticipated sideshow going on. So they're looking at that. The things that I think American Water is they did something with chloramines. And basically that it's not as reactive. It still does a decent job for being a disinfectant, but it's lower in those the disinfection byproducts that it causes. So they're trying to maintain their disinfection capability and reducing those side adverse effects from using straight chlorine. So everything, you know, like when I was in my toxicology class, you know, everything's a poison, it just depends on the dose. And you really are, you know, they're really trying to keep that as low as possible. The fluoride, I think they have just lowered it. I think they were talking about that after I left the department to lower it a little bit. But the data I was looking at that is kind of all over the place. You know, association doesn't mean cause. So I don't think they've been able to tease out the fluoride. Is a problem. Obviously, you want it as low as possible, no matter what it is.
Is there added fluoride in the system now?
Every water system does their own thing, but most of them are adding fluoride to some degree. Not all of them. It's not required. What's that?
Why?
Well, listen, supposedly for cavities.
Oh.
I'm just telling you.
All right.
Fluorinated toothpaste. That's
Question about the availability of water in a situation with power outage. I know, did you learn anything with Sandy? Yeah, obviously it becomes a big issue, but I was wondering if there was any lessons that were learned that could be of use.
Did I learn anything?
Or, you know, what can we do if the power's out and our water supply is dependent on having electricity? Other than just hope for the benevolent
Power outage affecting the water supply system.
Yeah, well, one of the things after Sandy, which kicked everybody in the butt pretty hard, we found the water systems actually pretty resilient, but after that, backup generation is being required. We had a lot of places that said, well, we have one that we can get from a rental company, and then they found out 7 other water systems were going to that same rental company, which didn't work. So the requirements for emergency response is like, you know, if you can't, it's not always effective. These generators that you need to run a treatment plant aren't like the ones you get in Hondas at the Home Depot. They're pretty big, and so we're working on, can people share them? You put them on a flatbed, you have a quick connect. I run it enough so you can put the 2 or 3 million gallons in your tank for storage, run it over there, fill theirs, and then have a plan where everybody's filling their tanks to at least keep pressure. So the state's looking at a lot of that. Like I said, Sandy, really, like, you know, where you're weak, that really showed us where. And asset management came to fruition. And when I was there, we put out a lot of documents. And if I can't keep saying I haven't been there for a while, if they could get some of the allocation rules out, some of these requirements will be codified so that people will have to have emergency response plans and will have to have generation. And even more importantly, some places found out they didn't have gas for the cars for people to get to where they had to get, because when all the gas stations went down, their key employees couldn't get to the place because they didn't have gas. So they're looking at all of those things. So I think we are getting more resilient, but it's like everything else. It's like a drought. When a drought comes, everybody's talking conservation, do this, then it rains, everybody goes away. What happened on a drought team? They're gone. It's the same thing with a storm or a major emergency. You know, as that gets farther away from the hurricanes or any other storm, you guys on the coast get stuff all the time that doesn't get big press but beats everything up. you know, we gotta keep people vigilant, and that's what the rules were supposed to be, at least the drafted rules now. So I think it's a good point. We did learn a lot, and I think water systems learned a lot. And again, the resiliency of the water systems, even though you get a lot of criticism, between Mount Logan and down there, I mean, a major line was just blown out when the storm just took everything out. Within a few days, the water systems they had put that line back. And they were pressurizing each little zone, seeing where the leaks were and fixing them. And how fast they responded to that was pretty good. So I think sometimes we're critical of certain things today, but those institutions responded pretty well during that storm, at least from the water supply standpoint. And I have a lot of respect for the people that responded. And I think they did well. And that was good.
Okay, and now that really was the last question. And I think we all should thank our speakers this evening. I think we learned a lot.